The breach alarm screamed through Kit's helmet comm, red warning lights strobing across her visor display. She cut the noise with a sharp gesture, her magnetic boots clanging against the twisted hull plating as she moved through the debris field surrounding the derelict warship. 47 hours ago, long-range sensors had detected the carrion's wake drifting in contested space, its transponder dark, its massive bulk spinning slowly against the starfield like a dead whale in an ocean of black. Now, as Kit approached the ship's primary airlock, every instinct honed by 15 years of salvage work told her this job was wrong. Dead wrong. The carrion's wake shouldn't exist. According to the manifest data transmitted from Grimholt Station, this particular destroyer-class vessel had been decommissioned and scrapped 3 years ago. Yet here it was, intact and drifting through the Ashford system like a ghost ship with a story to tell. Kit's partner floated 20 meters off her starboard side, his bulky environmental suit making him look like a mechanical spider against the ship's hull. Dean had been welding breaches in derelict vessels since before she'd learned to walk in zero-G. And if the man was nervous, he wasn't showing it. Your atmospheric readings. Veltes's voice crackled through the comm, smooth and precise despite the distortion. The alien's multitonal pronunciation of standard carried that familiar musical quality that made Kit's chest tighten in ways she preferred not to examine too closely. The forensic decay specialist hung suspended in her specialized harness 50 meters above the ship's superstructure, her elongated limbs positioned with the careful precision of a surgeon. Veltes's species had evolved in zero-G environments, and watching her work was like watching a dancer who'd never known the tyranny of gravity. Internal atmosphere is 93% nominal. Bexara reported from her position near the ship's atmospheric processors. The atmospheric scrubber's voice carried the subtle harmonic undertones that indicated stress in her species. But the decay patterns are inconsistent with the reported timeline. Dean grunted, his torch sending blue-white sparks cascading around the airlock mechanism. That's what we're here to figure out, isn't it? Kit studied the tactical display projected on her visor, watching the patterns of debris surrounding the carrion's wake. Something had torn pieces from the ship's hull, but the damage patterns didn't match standard weapon signatures. The gouges looked almost organic, as if something had been feeding on the metal. She pushed the thought away. Focus on the job. Document everything. Ask questions later. The airlock cycled with a sound like distant thunder, and Kit felt the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with dread that came with entering a dead ship. The emergency lighting cast everything in shades of red and amber, and the air tasted of recycled fear. The cargo bay stretched before them, massive and empty except for the shadows. But as Kit's suit lights swept across the space, she realized it wasn't empty at all. The cargo containers were there, row upon row of them, but they were wrong. The manifest had listed medical supplies and terraforming equipment. These containers bore the stark warning symbols of weapons-grade materials. Dean whistled low. That's not medical supplies. Veltes drifted closer, her instruments already scanning the nearest container. The decay patterns on these seals indicate they've been opened recently, within the last 72 hours. Kit felt the familiar knot of tension forming in her stomach. In salvage work, recently opened containers on a supposedly abandoned ship meant one thing. Someone else had been here first. Someone who might still be aboard. She activated her proximity sensors, watching the display for any sign of movement. The ship's corridors stretched away from the cargo bay like arteries leading to a dead heart, and somewhere in that labyrinth of metal and shadows, answers waited. Keep scanning, she told Dean. I want to know what was in those containers. The welder nodded, his torch already moving toward the nearest seal. Kit had worked with Dean for 3 years, and she'd learned to read the subtle tension in his movements. He was worried. When Dean was worried, smart people paid attention. Moving to the ship's data core, she transmitted to the team. See if anyone left breadcrumbs. The corridors of the carrion's wake whispered with the sound of recycled air and distant metal stress. Kit's boots made soft magnetic contact with the deck plating as she moved through the ship's central passage. Her suit lights cutting through the darkness like surgical instruments. The data core sat in the ship's computational center, 3 decks down from the cargo bay. As Kit made her way through the ship's mechanical spaces, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation crawled between her shoulder blades like a living thing, and twice she spun around, hand moving instinctively to her plasma cutter. Nothing. Just shadows and the soft hum of life support systems running on emergency power. She reached the data core and began the interface process, her suit's computer establishing a connection with the ship's central systems. The download would take 20 minutes, plenty of time to explore the adjacent compartments. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Even through her suit's filtration system, the odor was unmistakable. Death, recent death. Something had died aboard the carrion's wake, and not that long ago. Kit activated her comm. I'm detecting biological contamination near the data core. Possible casualties. How many? Veltes's voice carried a note of professional interest. The alien species had evolved from scavengers, and death held no emotional weight for them. It was simply data to be processed. Unknown, moving to investigate. The crew quarters were located 1 deck above the data core, and as Kit made her way through the ship's maintenance passages, the smell grew stronger. Her suit's atmospheric sensors began registering organic compounds that shouldn't exist in a ship's processed air. She found the first body in the officers' quarters. The man wore corporate security armor, the kind used by high-end military contractors. His weapon was still holstered, and there were no obvious signs of trauma. He'd simply died, as if something had switched off his life like a circuit breaker. Kit photographed the scene, her suit's cameras recording everything from multiple angles. The corporate logo on the dead man's armor was familiar: Dominion's Security Syndicate. One of the big 3 military contractors, the kind that handled black operations for planetary governments. Found our recent visitors, she transmitted to the team. Corporate mercenaries. At least 1 casualty. Cause of death, Dean asked. Unknown, no obvious trauma, he just stopped. Kit moved through the rest of the crew quarters, finding 2 more bodies. All corporate security. All dead without apparent cause. The ship's log would have answers, but something about the scene made her want to finish the survey first. The bridge was 2 decks up, and as Kit made her way through the ship's central corridor, she began to notice other details. Scratches on the bulkheads that looked like claw marks. Patches of what might have been dried blood on the deck plating, and everywhere that persistent smell of death and decay. She paused at a junction between corridors, studying the ship's layout on her visor display. According to the schematics, the carrion's wake was a standard destroyer-class vessel, but something felt wrong about the proportions. The ship was too big, as if someone had added compartments that didn't appear on the original blueprints. Kit, Dean's voice crackled through the comm, urgent now. You need to see this. She made her way back to the cargo bay, moving faster now, her magnetic boots finding purchase on the deck plating with practiced efficiency. Dean was standing beside one of the opened containers, his torch casting wild shadows on the bulkheads. The container was empty, but the walls were scarred with what looked like blast patterns. Something had been stored here under pressure, and it had escaped with considerable violence. What was it? Kit asked. Dean shook his head. I don't know. But whatever it was, it's not here anymore. Veltes's voice cut through the comm channel. I'm detecting movement in the ship's lower sections. Multiple signatures. Kit felt her blood turn to ice water. Movement meant they weren't alone. Movement meant whatever had killed the corporate security team was still aboard. She activated her proximity sensors, watching the display for any sign of the contacts Veltes had detected. The ship's lower sections were primarily engineering spaces, areas where someone could hide for days without being detected. All teams, she transmitted, were not alone on this ship. Unknown contacts in the lower engineering sections. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. In salvage work, unknown contacts usually meant pirates, claim jumpers, or worse. But given the dead corporate security team, Kit suspected they were dealing with something more dangerous. Dean moved to her side, his welding torch now held like a weapon. The man had survived 15 years of salvage work by being prepared for trouble, and his stance told Kit he was expecting it. "Orders?" he asked. "We finish the job," Kit said, "but we stay together. No one goes anywhere alone." The ship's data core finished its download with a soft chime, and Kit disconnected her suit's computer from the ship's systems. The information they'd gathered would have to be enough. Whatever was moving in the engineering sections, she didn't want to encounter it while separated from her team. As they made their way back through the ship's corridors, Kit couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded. The movement signatures that Veltes had detected seemed to be driving them toward the cargo bay, as if whatever was aboard the Carrion's wake wanted them in a specific location. She activated her comm. "Veltes, what's your status?" The forensic specialist's voice carried a note of concern. "The decay patterns I'm detecting are unlike anything in the standard database. Whatever caused the damage to this ship, it's not from any known weapon system." "Bexara," Kit transmitted. "Atmospheric readings." The atmospheric scrubber's harmonic tones carried desperation. "Internal atmosphere is being actively processed by something, not the ship's standard systems. Something else." Kit felt the knot of tension in her stomach tighten. Active atmospheric processing meant biological systems. Something alive was aboard the Carrion's wake, something that breathed and metabolized and left chemical signatures in the air. As they reached the cargo bay, Kit's proximity sensors exploded with contacts. Dozens of them, moving through the ship's corridors like a coordinated swarm. Whatever was aboard the Carrion's wake, it had been waiting for them to gather in one location. The first attack came from the ventilation system. Something that moved like liquid metal poured through the atmospheric vents, flowing across the cargo bay's ceiling before dropping onto the deck with a sound like breaking glass. In the emergency lighting, Kit caught glimpses of something that might have been organic, might have been technological, might have been both. Dean's torch blazed to life, sending white-hot plasma streaming toward the creature. The beam passed through it without effect, as if he was trying to burn water. The thing flowed toward them with predatory grace, and Kit found herself backing toward the airlock, her plasma cutter in her hand. Behind her, she could hear Veltes's analytical voice describing the creature's movement patterns with scientific detachment. "Fascinating. The organism appears to be a hybrid of organic and synthetic components." Not helping, Kit snapped, her cutter beam slicing through the air where the creature had been a moment before. The thing moved like it was learning, adapting to their weapons with each attack. When Dean's torch swept toward it, the creature flowed away. When Kit's cutter beam tracked its movement, it split into multiple components, each moving independently. "The airlock," Dean said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "We need to reach the airlock." But as they backed toward the exit, more creatures began pouring through the ventilation system. Dozens of them, moving with the fluid coordination of a pack hunter. In the strobing emergency lights, they looked like living shadows, dark shapes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Kit's suit sensors screamed warnings as the creatures began to surround them. Her atmospheric readings showed chemical compounds that shouldn't exist, organic signatures that registered as both alive and dead simultaneously. The first creature reached Dean before he could react. It flowed up his legs like living oil, and where it touched his environmental suit, the material began to dissolve. Dean screamed, a sound that cut through the comm channel like a blade, and Kit saw his suit's integrity readings plummet. She grabbed him, pulling him toward the airlock, but the creatures were everywhere now, flowing across the deck like a tide of hungry darkness. Her plasma cutter carved through them, but they reformed instantly, as if the energy only made them stronger. Veltes's voice cut through the chaos. The atmospheric processors. They're not cleaning the air, they're feeding the organisms. Kit's mind raced. If the atmospheric processors were feeding the creatures, then the ship's life support systems had been corrupted, turned into a breeding ground for whatever these things were. Bexara, she transmitted, can you shut down the atmospheric processors? The atmospheric scrubber's harmonic tones carried desperation. I'm trying, but the system has been modified. The controls are not responding to standard commands. The creatures surged forward, and Kit felt one of them touch her leg. Where it made contact, her suit's material began to smoke, and she could feel the thing's hunger like a physical presence pressing against her mind. She triggered her suit's emergency beacon, sending a distress signal to any vessels in the area. If they didn't make it off the carrion's wake, at least someone would know what had happened. Dean stumbled, his suit's life support systems failing as the creatures continued their assault. Kit caught him, supporting his weight as they fought their way toward the airlock. The creatures flowed around them like living water, and Kit realized with growing horror that they were being herded again. The things weren't trying to kill them immediately. They were driving them toward a specific location, as if they wanted the humans alive for some purpose. She activated her suit's recording systems, broadcasting everything to the emergency beacon. Whatever these creatures were, someone needed to know about them. The airlock cycled with agonizing slowness, and as the outer door opened, Kit saw their salvation. Bexara hung suspended outside the ship, her atmospheric processing equipment glowing with desperate energy as she worked to override the ship's corrupted systems. The atmospheric scrubber's voice carried triumph. I've isolated the atmospheric processors. The organisms are losing their food source. Behind them, the creatures let out a sound like screaming metal, and Kit felt a chill that had nothing to do with the vacuum of space. The things were intelligent. They understood what was happening, and they were angry. Dean's suit was failing, his life support systems overwhelmed by the creature's corrosive touch. Kit sealed the emergency patches as best she could, but she knew he needed medical attention that their small salvage team couldn't provide. Veltes's voice cut through the comm channel. I'm detecting a massive energy signature building in the ship's core. I believe the organisms are preparing to abandon the vessel. Kit looked back at the carrion's wake, watching as dark shapes began pouring from the ship's hull breaches. The creatures were leaving, flowing out into space like a school of predatory fish. She activated her suit's thrusters, pushing away from the derelict as fast as the small motors could manage. Behind her, Dean groaned as his suit's medical systems worked to stabilize his injuries. Where are they going? She asked. Veltes's instruments tracked the creature swarm as it moved through the debris field. Unknown, but their trajectory suggests they're heading for the inner system. Kit felt a chill that had nothing to do with the vacuum of space. The inner system meant populated worlds, space stations, mining colonies, places where the creatures could find new hosts, new sources of food. She opened a channel to Grimholt Station. Emergency transmission. This is Salvage Team 7 aboard the carrion's wake. We have encountered hostile xenobiological entities. Recommend immediate quarantine of the Ashford system. The response came back immediately. Salvage Team 7, this is Grimholt Station. We're not reading any xenobiological signatures in your area. Are you certain of your report? Kit looked at Dean, whose suit was still smoking from the creature's touch. She looked at the carrion's wake, now dark and silent as the organisms abandoned it. She looked at the swarm of dark shapes moving through space toward the inner system. Confirmed, Grimholt Station. We have multiple casualties and evidence of weapons-grade biological contamination. Request immediate medical evac and military response. The silence that followed was telling. When Grimholt Station finally responded, the voice was different. Colder. Salvage Team 7, you are ordered to return to base for debriefing. Your findings will be classified pending review. Kit felt the familiar knot of tension in her stomach tighten. Classified pending review. That meant corporate interests, black budgets, and buried reports. It meant the creatures would be studied, weaponized, and eventually deployed. Dean's voice was weak but determined. They already knew, didn't they? That's why the corporate team was here first. Kit studied the debris field around the carrion's wake, noting the patterns of destruction, the way the ship had been gutted from the inside. The corporate security team hadn't been there to investigate. They'd been there to retrieve something, and they'd found it. The creatures had been weapons. Biological weapons created by someone with enough resources to build a secret laboratory inside a decommissioned warship. The corporate team had been sent to recover the research, but they'd underestimated their creation. Now the weapons were loose, heading for populated space, and the same people who'd created them were trying to cover their tracks. She opened a private channel to her team. We're not going back to Grimholt Station. Not yet. Veltes's voice carried interest. You suspect deception. I suspect we're expendable witnesses to something that powerful people want kept quiet. Dean coughed, his suit's medical systems working to repair the damage to his lungs. So what's the plan? Kit looked at the data they'd recovered from the carrion's wake, the evidence of corporate involvement, the proof that someone had been conducting illegal biological weapons research in contested space. We follow the creatures, we document everything, and we make sure the truth gets out before they can bury it. The space around the carrion's wake was quiet now, the ship dark and lifeless as it continued its slow rotation against the starfield. But Kit knew the quiet was deceptive. Somewhere in the darkness, the creatures were spreading, carrying their hunger to new targets. And somewhere in the corporate boardrooms of civilized space, people were already planning how to profit from the chaos that would follow. The job was far from over. 3 hours later, Kit watched the creature swarm through her suit's long-range sensors as it approached the mining station at Ashford Prime. The facility housed 12,000 workers, their families, and a complement of corporate security that wouldn't last 10 minutes against what was coming. She opened a channel to the station's emergency frequency. Ashford Prime, this is Salvage Team 7. You have incoming hostile contacts. Recommend immediate evacuation. The response was immediate and bureaucratic. Salvage Team 7, this is Ashford Prime Traffic Control. We show no incoming traffic on our sensors. Please clarify your transmission. Kit felt the familiar frustration of dealing with corporate procedures in a crisis. The creatures were moving too fast for standard sensors to track, flowing through space like living shadows. Hostile biological entities, she transmitted. Recommend you go to red alert immediately. Dean's voice was stronger now, his suit's medical systems having stabilized his injuries. They're not going to listen. Corporate policy is to ignore threats that don't show up on standard sensors. Then we make them show up, Kit said. She activated her suit's active sensors, painting the creature swarm with targeting radar. The contacts lit up on her display like a constellation of malevolent stars, dozens of organisms moving with coordinated precision toward the mining station. The creatures responded to the radar sweep immediately, altering their trajectory to intercept Kit's team. She watched them approach, dark shapes that seemed to bend light around them, and felt the familiar chill of impending violence. "They're coming for us," Veltes observed with scientific detachment. "The organisms appear to be attracted to active sensor emissions." Kit smiled grimly. "Then let's give them something to really focus on." She activated every sensor, every transmitter, every piece of electronic equipment on her suit. The space around her blazed with electromagnetic radiation, a beacon that would be visible to every sensor in the system. The creatures responded like predators scenting blood. They flowed toward Kit's team with renewed hunger, abandoning their approach to the mining station to focus on this new, more attractive target. "Ashford Prime," she transmitted. "Check your sensors now." The response came back immediately, filled with alarm. "Salvage Team 7, we're reading multiple contacts approaching your position." "What are those things?" "Weapons," Kit said. "Biological weapons created by someone with a corporate development budget. They're heading for your station." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. In the corporate-controlled systems, biological weapons meant political liability, criminal prosecution, and economic disaster, the kind of scandal that could destroy careers and topple governments. When Ashford Prime finally responded, the voice was different. Colder, more official. "Salvage Team 7, you are ordered to maintain radio silence and return to base immediately. Your current activities are in violation of corporate security protocols." Kit felt the familiar knot of tension in her stomach. Corporate security protocols meant damage control, cover-ups, and buried evidence. It meant the creatures would be allowed to reach the mining station while the corporate authorities figured out how to spin the disaster. She looked at her team, floating in the darkness around the carrion's wake. Dean, injured but determined. Veltes, analyzing the creatures with scientific fascination. Bexara, working desperately to understand the atmospheric processing systems that had created these things. They were 4 people against a corporate machine that spanned star systems, but they had something the corporations didn't: the truth. And the truth, Kit had learned, was a weapon that could cut through any lie. She opened a channel to the emergency broadcast network, the system used for navigational warnings and disaster alerts. The transmission would be received by every vessel in the system, every space station, every monitoring post. "Emergency broadcast," she transmitted. "This is Salvage Team 7 reporting the discovery of illegal biological weapons in the Ashford system. Unknown xenobiological entities are approaching Ashford Prime Mining Station. Recommend immediate evacuation." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of voices filled the comm channel, ship captains and station commanders demanding more information, confirmation, clarification. Kit began transmitting the data they'd recovered from the carrion's wake, the evidence of corporate involvement, the proof that someone had been conducting illegal weapons research in contested space. As the information spread through the system's communication network, she watched the creatures approaching their position. They moved with predatory grace, dark shapes that seemed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. But they were no longer moving toward the mining station. They were focused on Kit's team, drawn by the electromagnetic signatures of their active sensors. She looked at Dean, whose suit was still smoking from the creature's earlier attack. Ready for round 2, the welder activated his torch, the blue-white flame cutting through the darkness like a blade. "As ready as I'll ever be." The creatures hit them like a wave of living darkness, flowing around their position with fluid coordination. But this time, Kit's team was ready. They'd studied the organism's behavior, learned their patterns, discovered their weaknesses. The creatures fed on processed atmosphere, the artificial air that sustained life aboard ships and stations. But in the vacuum of space, they were vulnerable, dependent on the electromagnetic fields generated by their prey's equipment. Kit activated her suit's electromagnetic pulse generator, sending a burst of directed energy toward the nearest creature. The organism convulsed, its form becoming unstable as the electromagnetic field that held it together was disrupted. The other creatures recoiled, their coordination breaking down as they lost contact with their disrupted companion. In the brief moment of confusion, Kit's team struck. Dean's torch carved through the swarm, the superheated plasma disrupting the creature's molecular structure. Veltes's analytical instruments had been reconfigured into weapons, sending focused bursts of energy that made the organisms writhe and scatter. Bexara worked to maintain the electromagnetic field that kept the creatures at bay. Her atmospheric processing equipment generating the energy patterns that held the swarm at a distance. But there were too many of them, and they were learning. Each attack taught them something new about their prey, and they adapted with frightening speed. Kit felt one of the creatures touch her suit, and immediately her life support systems began to fail. The thing was somehow interfacing with her equipment, turning her own technology against her. She triggered her suit's emergency separation system, ejecting the damaged components before they could be completely corrupted. The creature flowed away, seemingly frustrated by the loss of its technological meal. Dean's voice cut through the comm channel. "They're not trying to kill us. They're trying to corrupt our equipment." Kit realized he was right. The creatures weren't predators in the traditional sense. They were parasites, feeding on the electromagnetic energy generated by advanced technology. In a universe filled with starships and space stations, they would have an endless supply of food. The implications were staggering. If the creatures reached the populated inner system, they would spread from ship to ship, station to station, corrupting and consuming the technology that kept civilization running. She opened a channel to the system-wide emergency network. All vessels, all stations. These organisms feed on electromagnetic energy. They're attracted to active sensors and corrupt technological systems. Recommend immediate shutdown of all non-essential electronics. The response was immediate and chaotic. Across the system, ships began shutting down their sensors, their communications, their navigation systems. The electromagnetic chatter that filled space fell silent as captains and commanders tried to make themselves invisible to the creatures. But the damage was already done. The creatures had tasted the electromagnetic feast of the Ashford system, and they would not be easily discouraged. Kit watched as the swarm began to spread, individual organisms breaking away from the main group, to investigate the various ships and stations scattered throughout the system. They moved with purpose, drawn by the faint electromagnetic signatures that even powered-down equipment couldn't completely suppress. She looked at the data they'd recovered from the Carrion's wake, the evidence of corporate involvement in creating these weapons. Someone had known this would happen. Someone had planned for it. The creatures weren't just weapons. They were a delivery system, a way to cripple the technological infrastructure of entire star systems. In the chaos that followed, the creators would be free to move in and take control. It was elegant. It was ruthless. It was completely amoral, and it was about to succeed. Dean's voice was quiet, filled with the kind of exhausted determination that came from facing impossible odds. "So what do we do now?" Kit looked at her team, floating in the darkness around the Carrion's wake. They were 4 people against a plan that had been years in the making, backed by resources that spanned star systems. But they had something the planners hadn't counted on. They had survived the creature's first attack. They had learned how to fight them, and they had proof of what was really happening. "We stopped them," she said. The next 6 hours would determine the fate of the Ashford system and possibly the entire sector. The creatures were spreading, the corporate cover-up was in full swing, and somewhere in the darkness, the real enemy was waiting to make their move. But Kit had been salvaging lost things for 15 years, and she'd learned something important in that time. Sometimes the thing you're looking for isn't what you expected to find. Sometimes it's exactly what you need. The space around Ashford Prime was chaos. The mining station had gone dark, its electromagnetic signature vanishing as the creatures swarmed over its hull. But the station wasn't dead. It was being systematically stripped of its technological components, its computer systems corrupted and consumed by the hungry organisms. Kit watched through her suit's passive sensors as the creatures flowed through the station's corridors, seeking out sources of electromagnetic energy. They moved like living circuit boards, their forms adapting to interface with different types of equipment. 12,000 people, Dean said, his voice heavy with the weight of failure. 12,000 people, and we couldn't warn them in time. They're not dead, Veltes observed with clinical precision. The organisms appear to be preserving biological life while consuming technological components. Kit realized the alien was right. The creatures weren't killers. They were converters, transforming advanced civilizations into something more primitive, more manageable. It was the perfect conquest strategy. Instead of destroying the population, the creatures would simply remove their ability to resist, leaving them helpless and dependent on whoever came to rescue them. She opened a channel to the system-wide emergency network. All vessels, all stations, the organisms don't kill. They preserve biological life while consuming technology. Any rescue operations should focus on evacuation, not engagement. The response was immediate and telling. A new voice cut through the comm channel, calm and authoritative. Salvage Team 7, this is Admiral Earl aboard the corporate vessel Dominion's Fist. We are moving to secure the affected area. You are ordered to stand down immediately. Kit felt the familiar chill of recognition. Admiral Earl was a name from the corporate military complex, the kind of person who handled situations that required both firepower and plausible deniability. The cavalry had arrived, but Kit suspected they weren't there to help. She activated her suit's passive sensors, scanning for the electromagnetic signature of the Dominion's Fist. The vessel was massive, a dreadnought-class ship with enough firepower to sterilize a small planet. But it wasn't alone. Kit's sensors detected a dozen smaller vessels, all bearing the corporate markings of Dominion Security Syndicate. The same company whose security team had died aboard the Carrion's wake. They were here to clean up the mess, and that meant eliminating the evidence, including the witnesses. Dean's voice was tight with controlled fear. They're not here to help, are they? Kit watched as the corporate fleet moved into formation around the affected area, their weapons systems charging. The creatures were still swarming over Ashford Prime, but they seemed unaware of the approaching threat. Or maybe they were expecting it. She opened a private channel to her team. We need to get out of here. Now. But before they could activate their suit thrusters, the space around them lit up with weapons fire. The corporate fleet had opened fire on the creature swarm, their plasma batteries sending streams of superheated energy through the darkness. The creatures reacted immediately, their forms becoming unstable as the electromagnetic pulses from the weapons disrupted their molecular structure. But instead of dying, they began to change. Kit watched in horror as the organisms absorbed the energy from the weapon's fire, their forms becoming larger, more complex. The plasma beams that should have destroyed them were instead feeding them, making them stronger. Admiral Earl's voice cut through the comm channel, no longer controlled. All ships cease fire. Cease fire immediately. But it was too late. The creatures had tasted the electromagnetic feast of military-grade weapons, and they were transforming. Their forms became more aggressive, more predatory. They stopped flowing like liquid and began moving like hunters. And they were hungry. The first ship to fall was a corporate destroyer, its hull breached by creatures that had grown large enough to tear through battle-grade armor. The organisms poured through the breach like living oil, and within minutes, the ship's electromagnetic signature began to change. It was being corrupted, turned into something new, something that served the creature's purpose. Kit realized with growing horror that this had been the plan all along. The creatures weren't just weapons. They were a transformation system designed to convert advanced civilizations into something more primitive. But they were also designed to be controlled. And someone had the control codes. She opened a channel to the corporate fleet. Admiral Earl, the creatures are being controlled. Someone is directing their actions. The response was immediate and telling. Salvage Team 7, you are ordered to maintain radio silence. Your transmissions are interfering with fleet operations. Kit felt the familiar knot of tension in her stomach. Interfering with fleet operations meant the corporate fleet was already compromised. The creatures weren't attacking randomly. They were following orders. She looked at the data they'd recovered from the Carrion's wake, the evidence of corporate involvement in creating these weapons. Someone had planned this entire scenario, from the derelict ship to the corporate cleanup operation. The creatures weren't out of control. They were doing exactly what they'd been designed to do. Dean's voice was quiet, filled with the kind of exhausted understanding that came from seeing the full scope of a conspiracy. We're not witnessing an accident. We're witnessing a demonstration. Kit realized he was right. The attack on Ashford Prime, the corporate fleet's response, the creature's transformation under weapons fire. It was all a carefully orchestrated show, designed to demonstrate the weapon's capabilities to potential buyers. And the buyers were watching. She activated her suit's long-range sensors, scanning for ships that might be observing the battle from a safe distance. The signatures were there, carefully hidden but detectable if you knew what to look for. Corporate observers, military attachés, and government representatives from a dozen star systems. All watching as the creatures systematically dismantled the Ashford system's technological infrastructure. The perfect weapon for the perfect war. Instead of destroying your enemy, you simply removed their ability to fight back. She opened a channel to the system-wide emergency network, broadcasting on all frequencies. This is Salvage Team 7. What you're witnessing is not an accident. It's a demonstration of illegal biological weapons. The creatures are being controlled by corporate interests. The response was immediate and chaotic. Voices filled the comm channel, demanding proof, confirmation, clarification. But Kit could also hear something else. Fear. The observers were realizing that they weren't just watching a demonstration. They were potential targets. Admiral Earl's voice cut through the chaos, cold and authoritative. All vessels, you are ordered to evacuate the Ashford system immediately. This area is under corporate quarantine, but the observers weren't leaving. They were positioning themselves for a better view, their sensors focused on the creature's behavior, their weapons systems charging in case the demonstration got out of hand. Kit realized that the situation was about to become much more complicated. The creatures had been designed to demonstrate their capabilities, but they were also designed to spread. And once they started spreading, they wouldn't stop until they'd consumed everything. The first observer ship to fall was a government vessel from the Outer Rim Coalition. The creatures flowed over its hull like living metal, their forms adapting to interface with the ship's defensive systems. But this time, something was different. The creatures didn't just corrupt the ship's technology. They began to replicate it, creating new organisms that carried the ship's design patterns. Within minutes, the space around the fallen vessel was filled with creature ships, hybrid organisms that combined biological and technological components. They moved with predatory grace, seeking out new targets to convert. Admiral Earl's voice cut through the comm channel, no longer controlled. All ships, emergency jump to hyperspace. Execute immediately. But the creature ships were faster. They flowed through space like living shadows, intercepting the fleeing vessels before they could activate their hyperspace drives. Kit watched in horror as the entire observer fleet was systematically corrupted, their ships transformed into hybrid organisms that served the creature's purpose. The demonstration had become a massacre. She opened a channel to her team. "We need to get out of here. Now." But as they activated their suit thrusters, Kit realized that escape might not be possible. The creatures had learned from their earlier encounters, and they were adapting their tactics. A group of organism ships had detached from the main swarm, moving to intercept Kit's team. They approached with coordinated precision, their forms shifting to match the electromagnetic signatures of their targets. Kit felt the familiar chill of impending violence. The creatures weren't just hunting them. They were studying them, learning their patterns, preparing to add them to their collection. She looked at her team, floating in the darkness around the carrion's wake. They were 4 people against a force that had just consumed an entire star system. But they had something the creatures didn't expect. They had survived the initial encounter, learned the organism's weaknesses, and discovered the truth about their origin. And sometimes, the truth was the most dangerous weapon of all. The final battle began with silence. The space around the carrion's wake was filled with the electromagnetic signatures of approaching creature ships, but no sound carried through the vacuum. It was a war fought in the darkness between stars, where the only witnesses were the cosmic background radiation and the distant light of dying suns. Kit's team had positioned themselves in the shadow of the derelict warship, using its bulk to mask their own signatures. It was a temporary measure at best, but it gave them time to prepare for what was coming. Dean had reconfigured his welding torch into a weapon, its plasma beam focused to cut through the creature's molecular structure. Veltes's analytical instruments had been converted into electromagnetic pulse generators, capable of disrupting the organism's coordination systems. Bexara worked frantically to maintain the atmospheric processing field that kept the creatures at bay. Her equipment generating the energy patterns that made the space around them hostile to the organisms. But Kit knew it wouldn't be enough. The creatures had learned from their earlier encounters, and they were adapting their tactics with frightening speed. She looked at the data they'd recovered from the carrion's wake, the evidence of corporate involvement in creating these weapons. Somewhere in that information was the key to stopping them. The creatures weren't just biological weapons. They were a control system designed to convert advanced civilizations into something more manageable. But every control system had a weakness, a way to turn it against its creators. She found it in the atmospheric processing data that Bexara had recovered. The creatures fed on processed atmosphere, the artificial air that sustained life aboard ships and stations. But they were also dependent on it, unable to survive in natural atmospheric conditions. The organisms were parasites, evolved to live in the technological environment of advanced civilizations. In the vacuum of space, they were powerful, but in a natural atmosphere, they would be vulnerable. Kit activated her suit's atmospheric processors, configuring them to generate the chemical signatures of a natural planetary atmosphere. The change was subtle, but it was enough to make the creatures hesitate in their approach. She opened a channel to her team. "I think I know how to stop them." The creature ships had reached the carrion's wake, their forms flowing over the derelict warship like living metal. But they were moving more slowly now, their coordination systems disrupted by the atmospheric changes that Kit's team was generating. Dean's voice was tight with controlled hope. "What do you need us to do?" Kit looked at the creature ships surrounding their position, their forms shifting and adapting as they tried to interface with the derelict's corrupted systems. The organisms were powerful, but they were also single-minded. They had been designed to consume technology, not to think strategically. "We need to make them think we're not technological," she said. "We need to make them think we're natural." It was a desperate plan, but it was their only chance. The creatures were drawn to electromagnetic signatures, the artificial patterns generated by advanced technology. But they were also repelled by natural patterns, the chaotic signatures of biological life. Kit activated her suit's biological mimicry systems, configuring them to generate the electromagnetic signatures of natural life forms. The change was subtle, but it was enough to make the creatures pause in their approach. The other members of her team followed suit, their equipment generating the complex patterns of biological life. To the creature's sensors, they would appear to be natural organisms, not technological targets. The creature ships recoiled, their forms becoming unstable as they tried to process the conflicting information. They had been designed to consume technology, but they were encountering something that registered as both artificial and natural. Kit realized that this was the creature's fundamental weakness. They were weapons, not life forms. They could adapt to technological challenges, but they couldn't understand the chaotic complexity of natural life. She opened a channel to the system-wide emergency network. All vessels, all stations, configure your systems to generate biological signatures. The creatures are repelled by natural electromagnetic patterns. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the system, ships and stations began reconfiguring their systems, generating the complex patterns of biological life. The creatures recoiled, their coordination systems overwhelmed by the chaotic signals. But the victory was temporary. The creatures were learning, adapting to the new signals. Within minutes, they would overcome their confusion and resume their attack. Kit looked at the data they'd recovered from the carrion's wake, searching for another weakness. The creatures were controlled by someone, directed by signals that came from outside the system. She found the control frequency buried in the ship's communication logs. It was a narrowband signal, heavily encrypted and almost impossible to detect. But it was there, directing the creature's actions with subtle precision. If she could disrupt the control signal, the creatures would lose their coordination. They would revert to their basic programming, which was to consume technology and spread. But without coordination, they would be vulnerable. A disorganized swarm was easier to defeat than a directed army. Kit activated her suit's communication systems, configuring them to generate a jamming signal on the control frequency. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The creature ships surrounding their position began to lose coordination, their forms becoming unstable as they lost contact with their controlling intelligence. They continued to attack, but their movements became erratic, uncoordinated. Dean's plasma torch carved through the confused swarm, the superheated beam disrupting the creature's molecular structure. Without their coordination systems, the organisms were vulnerable to direct attack. Veltes's electromagnetic pulse generators sent focused bursts of energy through the swarm, making the creatures writhe and scatter. The organisms were still dangerous, but they were no longer invincible. Bexara maintained the atmospheric processing field that kept the creatures at bay. Her equipment generating the energy patterns that made the space around them hostile to the organisms. But the real victory came when the jamming signal spread through the system's communication network. Other ships and stations began broadcasting the same frequency, disrupting the creature's coordination across the entire star system. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The creature ships lost their coordination, their attacks becoming random and ineffective. The organisms that had been systematically consuming the system's technology began to turn on each other, their basic programming driving them to compete for resources. Admiral Earl's voice cut through the comm channel, filled with desperate authority. All vessels cease jamming immediately. You are interfering with critical military operations. But it was too late. The creatures had lost their coordination, and the system's defenders were taking advantage of the chaos. Ships and stations that had been overwhelmed by the organized swarm were now fighting back against the confused organisms. Kit realized that Admiral Earl's fleet had been compromised from the beginning. The corporate vessels hadn't been there to fight the creatures. They had been there to control them, to demonstrate their capabilities to potential buyers. But now the demonstration was over, and the corporate fleet was trapped in the middle of a chaotic battle between their own weapons and the system's defenders. She opened a channel to the system-wide emergency network. All vessels, all stations. The corporate fleet is compromised. They are not here to help. Repeat, the corporate fleet is hostile. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Ships and stations across the system began targeting the corporate vessels, their weapons systems charging with desperate energy. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. The corporate fleet, caught between the confused creatures and the system's defenders, was systematically destroyed. Admiral Earl's vessel was among the first to fall, its hull breached by creatures that had been turned against their former controllers. But the victory came at a cost. The Ashford system's technological infrastructure was in ruins, its ships and stations damaged or destroyed. The creatures had been defeated, but the system would take years to recover. Kit looked at her team, floating in the darkness around the carrion's wake. They had survived the battle, but they were alone in a system that no longer had the technology to support them. Dean's voice was quiet, filled with the kind of exhausted satisfaction that came from surviving impossible odds. So what do we do now? Kit looked at the data they'd recovered from the carrion's wake, the evidence of corporate involvement in creating the creatures. The information was too important to die with them in the vacuum of space. We make sure the truth gets out, she said. We make sure this never happens again. The journey back to civilized space would be long and dangerous, but they had something more valuable than any salvage they'd ever recovered. The truth about what had happened in the Ashford system. And sometimes, the truth was the most valuable cargo of all. 6 months later, Kit stood in the witness dock of the Interstellar Criminal Court, her testimony echoing through the packed courtroom. The evidence they'd recovered from the carrion's wake had exposed a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of corporate power. The creatures had been created as weapons, designed to cripple the technological infrastructure of entire star systems. The attack on the Ashford system had been a demonstration, a way to show potential buyers what the weapons could do. But the demonstration had gone wrong. The creatures had broken free of their controllers, spreading chaos throughout the system. The corporate fleet sent to contain them had been destroyed, and the weapons had been defeated by the desperate ingenuity of the system's defenders. Dean sat in the gallery, his injuries healed but his eyes still carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed. Veltes and Bexara were beside him, their alien features calm but watchful. The prosecution had called them heroes, but Kit knew better. They were survivors, nothing more. They had stumbled into a conspiracy that was bigger than any of them had imagined. And they had managed to expose it through a combination of luck, skill, and stubborn determination. The judge was speaking now, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. The defendants were found guilty of crimes against humanity, conspiracy to commit genocide, and the illegal development of biological weapons. It was a victory, but Kit knew it was incomplete. The people who had created the creatures were in prison, but the knowledge of how to make them still existed. Somewhere in the corporate databases, the research data waited to be discovered by the next group of ambitious scientists. The war between technology and biology would continue, fought in the shadows between stars. But at least now, people knew it was happening. As she left the courthouse, Kit felt the familiar call of the salvage yards. There were always more derelicts to investigate, more mysteries to solve. The universe was full of things that had been lost, abandoned, or forgotten. And sometimes, The most dangerous discoveries were the ones that were meant to stay lost. The carrion's wake had been destroyed, its hull broken apart and scattered across the Ashford system. But the memory of what they'd found there would stay with them forever. In the end, that was what salvage work was really about. Not just recovering what had been lost, but understanding why it had been lost in the first place. And sometimes, understanding was the most dangerous discovery of all.